We are talking about the evidences for God today. We're going to talk about it for 2 weeks because I don't want to rush through it. I don't want to go so slow you get bored, but I don't want to go so fast that we don't have time to really process some of this. And let me tell you why this material is important. You may not know that you know someone who is an atheist or who doesn't really believe in God. But there's a lot of people out there. There's a lot of people who've been misinformed. There's a lot of people, as we talked about on that continuum last week, that are ignorant. They don't know. And they don't know that they don't know. And so I'm arming you with material today to be able to have a conversation with them. And it was interesting. Brock Baker, who's the worship leader up in Scottsdale now, I was talking to him yesterday morning after church. And he just so happened to tell this story. It's popular right now in Hollywood to be a Christian. Now, I wish that I was just this much less cynical, but I'm not. But what happened was, remember the Bible that came on the History Channel a couple years ago? That was in 2014. That became the second most watched television program of the year, right behind the Super Bowl. And when everyone saw that people were really interested in the Bible, it became very vogue then to start reading the Bible and becoming Christians in Hollywood. Now, I'm not saying that some of those people haven't had true salvation experiences. I hope and pray that they have. But I think it's interesting that it's become popular in Hollywood after the ratings came out on the Bible. Okay? So there's a Bible study, quote, in Beverly Hills, basically for famous people and directors and actors, and they started with about 50 people a few years back. Now they're running about 1,500 people every week. So Brock goes to this Bible study. He's kind of one of the leaders of that. And so this guy comes up, because, Brock's a nice-looking kid, so he's always trying to get set up with women. And so, actually, he's not the one trying to set himself up. Other people try to set him up. So a guy comes up to him and says, I want to introduce you to this girl. She's super hot. She's a world-renowned supermodel, and she's here for the first time, and I want you to meet her. So, Brock's like, I can do that, So they introduce him to this supermodel. She's an atheist, and she was into science, and she says, if you can't prove it by science, I don't believe it, and that's why I don't believe in God. And so I said, well, you're not going to believe this, but I actually just wrote 6 pages of material where I condensed about 2,000 pages of material on this very topic. And so I sent him these notes yesterday because you meet these people that everything is evidence-based. And so I'm going to give you evidences. So if you're bored with this material, don't tell me. I'll never know the difference. And keep it, because you never know when you may refer back to it. Because if you get rid of this sheet of paper, you're going to have to go dig through 2,000 pages of material to replace it, okay? Now, I've only given you the first 4 pages today. It's 6 pages long because I know we're not going to get all the way through it, and then I'll bring the other next week. But if you'll keep this and bring it back next week, we're going to work through this document for 2 weeks, okay? So let's begin in Romans chapter 1, because I think Romans chapter 1 speaks to the condition of our culture today. And so I'm going to begin in 1:18. But God shows his anger from heaven against all sinful, wicked people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Now listen to how he describes them suppressing the truth by their wickedness. They know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. So God says, I've made myself obvious to them. You say, well, how did he do that? For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and his divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Isn't that interesting? That God said, listen, if you take the Bible and put the Bible aside and you never read the Bible, you still know there's a God simply through viewing creation. Simply through viewing creation. When you look at it, you know there's got to be a powerful creative being out there that created this. This can't have come about by accident. Right? But listen to what he says next. Yes, they knew God, But they wouldn't worship him as God or even give him thanks, and they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. So God says, I've made it obvious to them, but people in the hardness of their hearts became so selfish and so depraved that they came up with crazy ideas about God, and finally they just rejected him and really exalted earthly things, people, above God, and began to worship that instead. Now, does that not just a classic definition of our culture right now? And you run into people who say, I don't believe in a creator, I don't believe in a God, I believe in science. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with science and talk to these people and see where it goes, okay? So if you'll look, and I'm going to be doing some reading here primarily because this is very complex material, and I don't understand all the ins and outs of it, and so I want to make sure I get it correct and don't miss anything in the way of interpretation. I also, if you'll notice, I quoted a lot of scientists because I wanted you to see that I'm not just making this junk up, that this actually came from people who know what they're talking about, because I promise you I don't. Okay, so just remember that. On the video, this is going to be a little hard to follow because you don't have the printed material, but I'm gonna keep you up as much as I can. So I'm going to begin with the introduction here. Humans compile, consider, and make decisions every day based on evidence. We use our minds to reason, right? And just because you don't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I know that was a double negative, but do you get that? Just because I can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. There are all sorts of scientific proofs that something exists that we can't see. And so sometimes when I'm dealing with people on this level and they say, well, if I can't see it, I don't believe it. My usual response is, if that's the case, then let's go up to about a 5th-story building and let's test out gravity. Because you can't see gravity, but I promise you it exists. And if you don't believe it exists, all you have to do is jump off that building and we'll find out real quick. Well, suddenly, if you're standing on the ledge of a 5-story building, all of a sudden you may not see gravity, but you believe it exists, don't you? And so we all believe in things that we can't see. Now, when it comes for the evidence, for the proof of God, because a lot of times they'll say, give me the proof of God. I can't prove to you by touching and feeling God that he exists. But here's what I can do. We can look at the evidence for and against God, and we can make an assumption about God based on what reasonable people would conclude based on evidence. And so that's what we're going to be looking at. Okay? So I'm going to give you over the next 2 weeks 4 reasons that God exists. 4 reasons that God exists. And the first one is called the ultimate cause argument. The ultimate cause argument. For those of you who have done apologetics before, and if you've heard that word apologetics, that just means the study for the reasons for our faith. Okay, and so I'm not apologizing for anything when I use the word apologetics. That's the theological term for the reason that we believe what we believe. Okay? So it's called the cosmological argument, the reason the world exists. And the argument goes something like this. Number 1, things exist, correct? Can we buy that? I mean, we're not going to go that I believe, therefore I am. I think, therefore I am. I think is the exact, this is kind of a philosophical argument. Things exist, and we have to know why they exist. If there were nothing, there would not be an explanation. But because something exists, it requires an explanation of why it exists. And in philosophical terms, that's called sufficient reason. And that has nothing to do with Christianity or paganism or anything else. There's just a philosophical term called sufficient reason that if something exists, we want to know why it exists. Okay, so that's kind of point number one. Does that make sense to you in your brain? Okay, so point number two is this. Everything that exists is contingent. All living things need other living things to exist. So if something exists, we need to have a reason for why it exists, and everything that does exist is dependent or contingent upon something else to continue its existence. So let's talk about some examples of that. A tree in the forest. Is a tree in the forest contingent upon other things to exist? Yeah. Got to have water, got to have sunlight. And if you took away water and sunlight, could a tree exist for very long? No. Okay. How about a human being? Are there a few things we need to exist? Are we contingent upon something else to exist? Absolutely. We have to have food. We have to have water. There's all sorts of things. Well, we have a laundry list. We're kind of fragile beings. There's a laundry list of things we need in order to exist. Everything that exists is contingent, dependent upon something else in a closed system to exist. Okay? Now, there is something called the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics states that everything in a closed system is in a state of entropy. Okay? The second law of thermodynamics states in a closed system, everything's contingent upon each other, and everything that's contingent upon each other in a closed system is in a state of entropy. So now I need to define for you what entropy is, and then we're going to go around the table and we're going to talk about this for a minute. Entropy is this. Everything is in a state of decay unless an outside source, outside the closed system, intervenes. In other words, the natural source of all things goes from order to chaos, from birth to decay. So here's what I want you to do around your tables for a couple of minutes, and then we're going to come back, and I want to hear from each table. I want you to come up with 2 examples of entropy in the closed system of our world. 2 examples of entropy in our world. Okay? Now, our world sometimes is a closed system, but there are things that intervene that make it an open system. Okay? But if you think about a closed system where nothing else is brought into a process, things go from order to chaos, birth to decay. Give me 2 examples. Okay? We good? Okay. The human body, right? Just look at the human body. What do we go from? Birth to decay. Anybody who's over 30 years old, you're in decay. You can fight it as long as you want to fight it, but we all have the same end. Great illustration. 2, a car that you drive or a house. What happens if you have a house and it's uninhabited for a while? It begins to decay. One from nature that I find to be real easy to understand is, what happens if you take a body of water and you have no water coming in or no water going out? Get stagnant really quick, right? So in entropy, in a closed system, so when that pond is a closed system, it's going to decay. You have to bring in an outside source to bring life in, to bring new water, and it has to flow through and come out on the other side to keep that from happening, right? And so we go from order to decay. Now, I want you to look at the third part of this argument, because this is our first argument for the existence of God. How do we explain this dependency of all living things? So I want you to imagine a hula hoop, because I'm not very smart, so I have to think about ordinary things. But think about a hula hoop, okay? All creation is inside the circle of that hula hoop. What causes all this contingent, dependent stuff to exist? Now, there's one of 2 possibilities. Either the cause of its existence is something else in that hula hoop that is contingent and dependent. That's one possibility. Or its cause is something outside the circle that is uncaused, self-sufficient, independent, non-contingent, and eternal. And that's your two choices. So do you think something that is caused and dependent inside that circle caused the circle? Or do you think the ultimate cause is something outside the circle? And when you think about it reasonably, what's the answer? Something outside the circle. Well, when you go outside the circle to something that is self-sufficient, uncaused, independent, non-contingent, and eternal, you have a really good working definition of God. So that's the first argument that philosophers, this is really more from philosophy than it is from science, but philosophers use when they talk about the existence of God. So what I want to do is there's a lot of material I want to cover today, but I do want to stop right here, take 3 or 4 minutes around your table, and just talk about this argument. And does this argument make sense to you? In fact, I think the questions are here. Respond to the argument. Do you think this is a valid reason, a valid argument for the existence of God, and why? So just talk about that for 3 or 4 minutes, and we'll come back and look at the second argument in a moment. Now we get to the fun part. This is where we're going to spend most of our time the next 2 weeks, is in this second argument, which is called the teleological argument, and that is who is responsible for the design of the world. Did the world have a designer, or did it design itself by accident? And so this is where we're going to talk about evolution. This is where we're going to talk about the Big Bang Theory. This is where we're going to talk about all of the scientific evidence that has come out in the last 20 years to support that there is a designer and it was created, that this whole universe had an intelligent designer, God himself. And in the last 20 years, science has become the best friend of faith. The deeper they go into science, the more they learn about science, the more they realize, wow, this thing had to have a designer. This could not have happened by accident. Okay, so and you've got so much material here that we're not going to be able to go in depth in any of this. Partially because I'm not sure we could have an intelligent conversation if we went too in depth. And second, it's just massive amounts of information. But a lot of this came out of The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. I just encourage you to get this book. What he did is he took different areas of science. He went physics, astrophysics, biochemistry, and what he did, microbiology, and he interviewed people. And then he put together his evidence based on these interviews of people who were involved in that field, and it's just amazing. And then Patrick Glenn's God the Evidence, and we're going to be reading out of this book if we get to it in time today, if not next week, on some of the things he says. But we're going to start by dealing with Darwinism. You have to address Darwin because he, in many ways, started this mess that we're in now in the scientific world. I'll give you some history here. You can read through that history if you want, but I'm going to jump right into Darwin. Darwin is a product of the scientific revolution that happened in the 15, 16, 1700s. And so Darwin wrote this book called Origin of the Species, and at the time it made sense to him. It has since proven to be highly illogical. And so if you're going to embrace Darwinism, this is what you have to embrace. You have to embrace that nothing produces something, or everything, really. That non-life produces life. That randomness produces fine-tuning. Is that what the second law of thermodynamics teaches, entropy? No, it's exactly the opposite, right? That chaos produces information. That unconsciousness produces consciousness. And that non-reason produces reason. So if you're going to buy into Darwinism and evolution, that's what you're buying into. Now, we've already said that entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, is a physical law of nature that is exactly opposite of what this is. But that's what you have to buy into, okay? Now, by the way, they're not teaching this in your public high schools. So you probably need to take this information if you have a child growing up in public schools and teach them this information yourself. You need to take this and walk through this with them, okay? So the naturalistic processes have utterly failed to explain how non-living chemicals could somehow self-assemble into the first living cell. There is no explanation or theories by evolutionists on this subject, okay? So when you confront them and say, okay, let's just talk about it on the basic level, how did a non-living chemical cell evolutionize over into a living being, a living cell? And there is no information, there's no theory, they have no idea. You just have to accept that that could have happened. And if you don't accept that that could have happened, then Darwinism falls flat on its face. Biochemist Michael Denton observed the idea that undirected processes could somehow turn dead chemicals into all the extraordinary complexity of living things is, he says, no more or less than a great cosmogenetic myth. He says it's crazy to think that some non-living chemical out here over billions of years could actually produce the intricacies of the living things that we see today. He said it's an absolute myth. Okay? Second, in addition, you have to deal with a fossil record. And the fossil record has been greatly debated among evolutionists and creationists for generations now. But the fossil record refuses to confirm the claims of Darwinism transitions. Despite innumerable discoveries since Darwin's day, the intermediates have remained as elusive as ever, says Denton. Rather than harmonize into a case for Darwin's theory, the fossil records sabotage the leaps that Darwin's theory must account for, such as fish to amphibians and amphibians to reptiles. So in other words, we cannot deny that there is evolution, okay? And we'll talk about that in the last period. We can't deny that there's microevolution, but there's no evidence scientifically for macroevolution. So in other words, if you look at the evolutionary chain, there's these huge gaps in the evolutionary process. How did a fish get to an amphibian? There's nothing in the fossil record to say that it did. How does an amphibian get to a reptile? There's nothing in the fossil record to say that it goes, that there's that jump. There's these huge gaps in the record. And so what the scientists are saying is, okay, this is a great theory, but we're waiting for the gaps to be filled, and guess what? Gaps aren't being filled, okay? So the most glaring deficiency of the fossil record is biology's Big Bang theory or the Cambrian explosion. The majority, or to some experts all, of the world's 40 phyla, the highest category in the animal kingdom, virtually sprang forth with unique body plans more than 500 million years ago. The sudden appearance of these radically new life forms, devoid of prior transitions, has turned Darwin's tree of life on its head. And so in other words, you look at all the major phyla, and they come fully evolutionized without any sort of fossil record to show how that they could have come from a lower life form to a higher life form. Okay, so this is the conclusion then on the top of your page 2. Evolution is a confirmed fact as long as it is defined in the microevolutionary variations we see in the animal and plant world. Undeniably, a considerable amount of change and diversification has taken place over time. That's microevolution, right? There is changes. However, there is simply insufficient evidence from which to draw the radical conclusion that large-scale macroevolutionary transitions have occurred. Darwin himself admits the huge limitations in his theory, and I'll read that quote in a minute. But what we're saying is, it's obvious that over the last 100 years, there are new breeds of dogs. But a dog hasn't changed into... something else. It's still a dog. It hasn't changed into a wolf. It hasn't changed into another new species. Everything is, all evolution is within species. Does that make sense? And that's where the gaps are, is between species. Now, I want you to look at Darwin's quote here. He states in a chapter titled Difficulties with a Theory, he says this. This is Darwin's quote from his book. Here's his conclusion. To suppose that the human eye, with so many parts all working together, could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree. So Darwin lays out this theory and says, oh, by the way, I disagree with my theory. It's absolutely absurd. But you don't hear that, do you? But he even himself says, this is a crazy theory. So what I want to do is I want to stop here just for a minute, and I want you to just digest this information around your table and ask the question, what surprises you the most about this information? Is there something that surprises you here, and why does it surprise you? So just digest this for a couple of minutes. We don't have time to digest it for 30, unfortunately, because I want to get to a couple of other things this morning. So now we're going to get into the meat of the information. And something has to be wrong with me because this stuff excites me to no end. And so I just want to share with you a couple of things, and then after I share with them, I'm going to ask you if you're excited, and if you're not, then I'm going to judge you. So we'll see how it goes. I'm kidding. So let's begin our first evidence, and really the bulk of the evidence, because remember what we're doing here in these four arguments is no argument stands alone. What we're doing is we're putting together all the evidence among all of these different fields of science and philosophy, and then we're going to ask the question, what does the evidence say? Is it more likely that there is a God, or is it more likely that there is not a God and everything we know happened at random by accident? Okay? So the place where this really begins to take shape is in the area of physics. And in fact, Albert Einstein is the best thing that ever happened to faith. Because when he discovered the theory of relativity back in the 40s, it really began the study of modern physics, and the anthropic principle in 1973 actually is just what turned the tide toward Christianity, and it has gone that way ever since. And the anthropic principle is in my opinion, most powerful evidence for God that there is. And so we're going to talk about this principle, and probably what we're going to do is end today with it and begin next week with it, and then go from there, okay? Because this is really powerful stuff. So if you'll notice, on page 3, or the top of your second page, the evidence of physics, number 3, atheists explain that the design of our world is a chance collision of floating gases which set in motion a random series of events that over billions of years brought us to where we are today. Okay? So if you're going to believe in the theory of evolution, if you're going to believe that there is no creator, that there is no God, what you are believing, you're signing on the dotted line that you believe that's the most reasonable explanation for who we are and what we are and everything we have today. It was random chance of floating gases that were not alive, they were not alive chemicals that over billions of years that evolutionized, not created, evolutionized into what we have today. Okay? So, they cannot account for the origin of the gases. So in other words, even when you're talking to evolutionists about the Big Bang, well, it started with this explosion of gases. Okay, where'd the gases come from? Well, we hadn't got there yet. Okay, we can't account for the gases. We just know that they caused this huge explosion. But here's the thing. Mathematicians have actually begun to do some of the math on some of this, and the math is what blows me away and just has me shaking my head. But I want you to think about this. Mathematically, it is a 1 times 10 to the 243rd power chance for one single structured molecule to be created by accident. Okay, now I just want you to think about 10 to the 243rd power. And so one author that I was reading said literally, mathematically, this is correct. Mathematically, it is more likely for a tornado to hit a junkyard and randomly create a 747 jet than it is for random gases to produce life. Now, I want you to think about that. So if you think that mathematically it's possible for a tornado to run through here in a junkyard, and through that tornado out comes a jet airliner, then you ought to believe in evolution, because that's about the same mathematical probabilities. Okay? So, when scientists discovered quantum physics, okay, that comes out of Einstein, and the anthropic principle, Big Bang and Darwin's theory, was scientifically destroyed. The anthropic principle states, here it is, that all science and math formulas come together perfectly to create and sustain life. One minor change and life disappears. Now, I'm about to read you some stuff that I'm not asking you to understand the science. I'm asking you to try to grasp the probabilities of evolution. Okay? So physicist, philosopher Robin Collins states that gravity is fine-tuned to 1 part in 100 million billion 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 billion. And I did not misquote that, because when I was typing this up, I had the book open and I made sure, and it was 5 billions. That's how fine-tuned gravity is. The cosmological constant, which represents the energy density of space, is as precise as throwing a dart from space and hitting a bullseye just a trillionth of an inch in diameter on Earth. Now, I want you to think about that. There are more than 30 physical or cosmological parameters that require that precise of calibration in order to produce a universe that can sustain life. Many of these are found in Patrick Glenn's book, God the Evidence, and the evidence is so overwhelmingly powerful that when Patrick Glenn did his research into physics, he rejected his atheist beliefs and today says, the concrete data points strongly in the direction of the God hypothesis. It is the simplest and most obvious solution to the anthropic puzzle. So I want you to listen now as I read you. Here are some of the other examples of these physical or cosmological parameters that have to work together to produce life. Gravity is roughly 10 to the 39th times weaker than electromagnetism. If gravity had been 10 to the 33rd times weaker than electromagnetism, stars would be 1 billion times less massive and would burn 1 million times faster. The nuclear weak force is 10 to the 28th times the strength of gravity. Had the weak force been slightly weaker, all the hydrogen in the universe would have been turned to helium, making water impossible. A stronger nuclear force, by as little as 2%, would have prevented the formation of protons, yielding a universe without atoms. Decreasing it by 5% would have given it a universe without stars. If the difference in mass between a proton and a neutron were not exactly as it is, roughly twice the size of an electron, then all neutrons would have become protons or vice versa. You can say goodbye to all chemistry and, as we know it, life. He goes on and on and on and on. I'm not going to read you all 30 of them. Aren't you glad? But here's the point. He says when you lay out all the properties of physics and how it works together, it is absolutely, completely, mathematically impossible for what happened in the universe to happen by accident. There has to be a designer behind all of that, because these laws of physics are so perfectly aligned. Can you imagine throwing a dart from space and hitting a bullseye 1/1,000,000,000 of a size and diameter? It has to be that perfect for life to exist. And we're going to say that happened randomly by accident? There is no way it could be possible. If this is the kind of stuff that just razzes you and gets you excited about God like me, go buy Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Creator, and go find this book, God the Evidence by Patrick Glenn, and just go sit down and giggle at how great our God is. It's amazing. So, Collins affirms that the chance cannot reasonably account for the anthropic principle, and that the most discussed alternative among atheists is this: there are multiple universes. Okay, because remember the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle is everything was designed perfectly in line to sustain life for human beings. That's the anthropic principle. Anthropic, man. Everything lines up as a creation for man. It did not happen by accident. That's the anthropic principle. And science, physics specifically, really backs up that principle. And so evolutionists go, no, wait a minute. No, our solution to that is multiple universes. There are multiple universes. And here's what Collins says: multiple universes lacks any evidential support and ultimately collapses upon the realization that these other universes or worlds would owe their existence to a highly designed process as well. So in other words, he says, BS. That's what he says. Okay? So, when you take all that, I want to give it to us in something that maybe we can understand for us common people, and then the day is yours, and we will go on our way. And just read this information. Just try to soak it in this week, and then come back next week fired up, and we're going to talk about some more of this stuff. But here's our illustration for the common minds. If you put dimes, okay, if you have a dime, if you put dimes on the surface of the U.S., so imagine the surface of the U.S., how big that is, and we took dimes and we put dimes on the whole surface of the U.S. Got it? And then we stacked every one of those stacks of dimes on the surface of the U.S. and went all the way to the moon. That is how many scientific probabilities must remain in perfect harmony to sustain life in our universe. And you tell me it's by accident. Yeah, just take that one in and think about that for a while. So here's how we're going to close out. We're going to close out the video this way. There's a couple of questions here. I say this is the hardest material to grasp, but the most powerful reason for the existence of God. How do you respond to these discoveries in physics, and in what ways does this material bolster your faith? So I know we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left, but let's close out. Just respond to this material and what this does for your faith to know that this is out there, okay? And so the day is yours on the video. Thanks. We're coming back next week and finishing the arguments for the existence of God.